When we think of medieval prisons, what comes to mind are imposing castles and shadowy dungeons. But were these grand fortifications really built to imprison enemies, or did prisons begin to emerge in the brutal corridors of these castles? The truth is, initially, castles were not designed to serve as jails. In fact, many castles were used as administrative centers or as places of refuge and protection. Over time, however, the fortifications and their internal structures began to adapt to hold prisoners. The word dungeon, or dungeon as we call it today, originated in the 14th century, but at that time, it referred to the main tower of a castle, a place where the lord of the castle kept his treasures and exercised power. Medieval prisons were born out of a practical need, driven by the increasing number of conflicts and power struggles. In the beginning, prisoners were often placed in simple areas, such as guardrooms or even repurposed storage rooms. There was no detailed or structured plan to build prisons as we know them today. Many medieval castles, for example, transformed spaces like storage rooms or even guest chambers into places of confinement for criminals and prisoners of war. Lancaster Castle, in England, is a clear example of this. Originally a military fortress, it later became a place of imprisonment. Oxford Castle, another medieval icon, was also used as a prison in the late 12th century. But what makes these prisons even more terrifying is the fact that, often, prisoners were not treated as human beings. They were considered more like objects to be kept in captivity, away from the public eye, and often forgotten. It was a hopeless prison, where prisoners were left at the mercy of time, disease, and hunger. Castles, instead of being mere places of protection, turned into true dungeons, and their walls began to house not only kings and lords, but souls condemned to suffering. Medieval dungeons were not just places of physical imprisonment, they were designed to crush the spirit and sanity of prisoners. The design of these prisons was carefully thought out to ensure that no one left them without being deeply scarred, both physically and psychologically. Imagine being locked in a place with no windows, in total darkness, where the sound of your own breath becomes the only sound you hear. The biting cold seeped through the stone walls, while the dampness made the environment a breeding ground for disease. Every aspect of the dungeons was intended to leave the prisoner completely powerless and broken. What many don't know is that many of these dungeons had no access to natural light. The design was intentionally claustrophobic, with thick walls and heavy doors that sealed the prisoner in a world of total isolation. Isolation was one of the cruelest forms of punishment at the time. The prisoner was left alone for months, or even years, with no human contact. Time stood still. And this was not an accident, it was a strategy. The goal was not just to imprison physically, but to mentally destroy. Over time, this technique of destroying sanity became an effective way to punish even the most powerful enemies. Some dungeons had ingenious systems, like underground cells that could only be accessed by a narrow ladder or an opening in the ceiling. This made the prison even more harrowing because the prisoner knew that the only way out was through a tiny hole, something physically impossible for anyone who wasn't small and frail. These extreme conditions were designed to make the prisoner surrender to their own helplessness, with no hope of rescue or escape. Thus, life in medieval dungeons wasn't just physical torture, but a psychological battle, and for many, this battle was lost before it even began. Imagine spending years locked in a place where time loses all meaning, and the only thing that changes is your body, weakening each day. In medieval dungeons, many prisoners were completely forgotten. There were no trial dates, lawyers, or visitors. They were simply left to rot in the shadows, far from any hope of rescue. For those imprisoned for political or even religious reasons, isolation was a form of control, a way to make them feel insignificant. The absolute silence was oppressive, as if the very walls suffocated any thought or memory of freedom. These prisoners, known as the Forgotten, were often thrown into tiny cells where there was practically no room to move. They had no right to regular food or medical care. Diseases like tuberculosis and the Black Plague spread rapidly due to the unsanitary environment, and prisoners, weakened by the lack of food and care, died without even a word of comfort. The extreme loneliness made many lose their sanity, and the pain of knowing that no one knew where they were, or if they were still alive, became unbearable. These prisoners were often left to die in complete obscurity, never seeing the light of day, or hearing a kind word. Medieval dungeons were not just places of physical torture, but of total psychological annihilation, where forgetting them was the cruelest punishment. Inside medieval dungeons, the living conditions were nearly unbearable. Imagine being forced to live in an environment where darkness was constant, and the cold seeped into your bones. There was no heating, and the cold wind that passed through the cracks in the walls made the environment even more unbearable. Dampness was another relentless enemy. The cold, wet stone walls created a perfect setting for the growth of fungi and bacteria. The only thing prisoners could do was curl up in dirty rags or what was left of a piece of rotting straw, which hardly offered any protection from the biting cold. Food was scarce and always inadequate. Meals, when offered, consisted of hardened bread or some thin soup, with at most a few vegetables, but they were often spoiled. It was common for rats and insects to feed on what was left, competing with prisoners for the little food available. Diseases, like the plague and cholera, were constant, and the lack of medical care made these diseases even more deadly. Prisoners, weakened by hunger and poor hygiene, often died before even being tried. The torture did not only come from physical violence, but also from the daily struggle against the body itself and the conditions the environment imposed. The cold and lack of food caused weakness, while the absence of light led to disorientation and despair. For those who survived longer, the real battle was not just against the chains, but against the total dehumanization that this environment caused. Medieval prisons were not just places of physical imprisonment, they were also sites of brutal torture, where pain and suffering were imposed as a form of punishment and control. The torture techniques used in the dungeons were elaborate and often bizarre, designed not only to extract confessions, but to break the spirit of the prisoner. Psychological torment was as cruel as the physical, and the scars left by these practices lasted a lifetime. Among the most well-known tortures were the tight iron shirt, a garment full of spikes that, when placed on the prisoner, caused intense pain, often leading to death. Another infamous method was strangulation with the rope, where the victim was hung until their breath was cut off, but not killed immediately. The torture wheel, where prisoners were tied and spun repeatedly until their bones broke, was also a common sight in medieval dungeons. But torture was not limited to the instruments. The simple act of immobilizing prisoners for long periods in painful positions was also a form of torture. Additionally, there was the use of fire and water, with the practice of drowning being one of the most common methods of torture. Sometimes prisoners were submerged until they lost consciousness and then revived to suffer more. These methods were not only used to punish criminals, they were also applied to force prisoners to confess to crimes, many of which they had not committed. It was a brutal society, where physical pain and psychological degradation became a form of social control. The food in medieval dungeons was as cruel as the physical and psychological conditions imposed on prisoners. The diet of the condemned consisted mainly of hard bread, watery soups, and, at best, some decaying meat or rotten vegetables. Food was scarce, of poor quality, and rarely provided regularly. In many prisons, prisoners were forced to share the worst of what little there was, with no concern for hygiene or nutrition. Hunger was constant, and many prisoners suffered from severe malnutrition, which further worsened their physical conditions. There were no proper medical care, so diseases associated with the lack of nutritious food were common. Diseases like scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, and tuberculosis, worsened by the lack of warmth and hygiene, spread quickly. But poverty was also present in every aspect of life in the dungeons. The lack of adequate clothing and the filth in the environment made life even harder. Prisoners often slept on dirty straw mattresses, which were never replaced, creating a fertile ground for fleas, lice, and other parasites. The cruelest part of all was that hunger was not just a consequence of the lack of food, but also a form of psychological torture. Food deprivation became a way to humiliate and strip prisoners of their dignity. They lived with the constant sensation of hunger but never knew when or if they would receive a meal. This daily suffering eventually wore down the prisoners' physical and mental resilience, making them even more vulnerable to manipulation and control by the jailers. Medieval prisons were designed to ensure that escape was not just difficult but virtually impossible. The engineering behind these dungeons left no room for error. Every wall, every gate, every room was built with the intent to contain prisoners permanently. The goal was simple: do not let anyone out. To achieve this, castles and dungeons employed security measures that today seem from another world, such as secret passages, complex locks, and even disguised traps. In many cases, the doors of the cells were made of solid iron, with bolts that required immense force to open. Some castles had secret passages that led to areas inaccessible to anyone who didn't know the way. The Tower of London, for example, had a series of underground passages that allowed prisoners to be moved from one cell to another without being seen, making any rescue or escape attempt difficult. Additionally, the cells were often located in hard-to-reach places, like basements or the highest parts of the fortifications, where any escape attempt would be halted by the height or the thick walls. Even if a prisoner were lucky enough to escape the cell, constant surveillance was another nearly insurmountable barrier. Guards relentlessly patrolled the castles and dungeons, and any escape attempt resulted in even harsher punishment. Escapees were hunted down mercilessly, and those who were recaptured were often executed in exemplary fashion, to serve as a lesson to others. Escape, therefore, was an impossible dream, an illusion fueled by desperation, but crushed by the harsh reality of medieval imprisonment. The fate of prisoners in medieval dungeons was, for the most part, an endless tragedy. For many, imprisonment was not a sentence of time, but a sentence of death. When they were not condemned to a public execution or death at the hands of the guards, many prisoners met their end in the miserable conditions of the dungeons. The unsanitary environment, confinement, and lack of food made survival a constant struggle, and many died from diseases, malnutrition, or simply from the cruel lack of medical care. Prisoners in the dungeons were not just victims of physical violence, they were victims of a system that condemned them to be forgotten and ignored. Many, for example, died from hunger, a slow and agonizing death, fueling the tragedy of endless imprisonment. But for others, the end was even more brutal. Execution on the gallows, where death came swiftly but was filled with humiliation. These public executions were used as an example to the population, a grim reminder that disobeying the law or challenging authority meant a painful and public death. And, while death was, for many, a release from the daily suffering, there was no honor nor rest for medieval prisoners. The lack of proper burial or a tomb worthy of the name meant that many bodies were simply thrown into mass graves, disappearing without a name, without a memory, left to rot out of sight of society. The legacy of these lost souls is one of the saddest legacies of medieval prisons. Lives erased without any honor or recognition. Did you know medieval prisons were this cruel? If you were shocked by what you just heard, don't forget to leave a like here and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more impactful stories like this one. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated and keep diving into the darkest tales of history. See you in the next video.